by Danny Ciarma from Urban DC, Managing Director there. Danny, before we get into Urban DC and the businesses you've worked for in the past, I want to start with your upbringing. You grew up in a country town called Kilmore in Victoria. Tell us about your early days and your childhood.
I grew up in Epping until about the age of 10, when Dad was a builder developer, and then in the late 70s he sort of hit the skids a bit there in the recession, and so we moved to the country, and he just did a bit of part-time contracting work and a few buildings here and there, but then started training horses. So really from about 9 to 10 years old, I grew up in Kilmore, and Dad was a horse trainer. And look, normal childhood. I pretty much spent my weekends and most nights out in the stables and working horses, and went to the trots and pretty much every weekend. And by the time I was 16, I actually got my licence and did a bit of racing. It's one of those sports that really suck you in. So getting into year 12, I decided that I'd better push that aside and focus on what I really wanted to do.
And you mentioned there that your dad was a builder developer, so you were always growing up, you were always on building sites, seeing how things could get done and would get built. Tell us about that. Is that what sparked the interest to get into property later in life?
For sure. I mean, I grew up, walking around building sites, and even today when I go on my own building sites, I love the smell of the sawn timber, and then the smell of the carpet when the finishes go down. So absolutely, it was just sort of part of within my blood, really. But what really captivated me was Dad kept all his architectural plans in the garage. And from a young age, I used to go in there and just look at all the blueprints and the architectural drawings. And back then it was all hand drawn. And I loved drawing. I'm left-handed and I love drawing. And I remember saying at the age of about 6, I said, I want to do this, and my dad said, you want to be an architect? And I said, yeah, I want to be an architect. And all my life, that's all I ever wanted to do.
So you finished high school and then you went and studied architecture, did you, at university? Tell us about that. What did you learn at university?
Oh, look, so I went to Deakin Uni in Geelong and studied architecture. Look, really, architecture was fantastic because what it really taught me was the importance of good design. All right, and the importance of placemaking and what the human environment should look like, and how humans live. And and that's something that I still bring through to my career now on a daily basis.
And I think the other thing that you spoke about in other interviews is when you were at university, you learnt the importance of property economics.
Yeah, look, there was I think it was about a third-year subject. It was called feasibility studies, and up until that stage, all we were concentrating on was, how do you do drawings, how do you write like an architect, and the history of art and architecture and what determines good design and so forth. But this particular subject was about, teaching us how to measure up a building, the gross floor area, the net floor area, and then putting it into a feasibility, putting in a land price, and then, distilling a profit. And that really sort of jolted me, because it sort of made me realise, that's the economics behind, architecture, right? And that's how you monetise the built form, So that sort of stuck in my mind, and probably the first sort of insight into what a developer would do, really.
And after university, you go and work at Village Roadshow, following your studies and your 2-year mandatory period in becoming a registered architect. Tell us about that role. I think it was a project manager role that you were doing at Village Roadshow. What did that entail?
Yeah, that was fantastic. That was really the thing that really got me going, got me on the road to development. So once I got registered as an architect, so I always wanted to say I'm an architect. I worked 6 years at uni for it and 2 years in private sector to get registered. So I wanted to do that. But it was at that time that I realised it wasn't for me. Because when I went out into the workforce in architecture, it was all CAD, computer-aided design. I was just drafting all day. It just wasn't fulfilling my needs and the excitement that I thought architecture was. So I wanted to transition to project management. It's very hard to transition from one career to another. Luckily, I worked at Village Roadshow part-time when I did my 5th and 6th year at uni. So I knew the boss, I knew all the players there. And when they found out I wanted to do project management, I got invited to work back within Village Roadshow. And the good thing, the reason why it was a good transition was we did in-house drafting as well, or architecture, in-house architecture, project management, construction management, and all of that. So I worked there for about 6 years, and it was a fantastic grounding because we had our own fit out contractor that we had to manage, project manage, but then we had to manage the relationship between the lessor and the lessee because we were pretty much in shopping centres most of the time. And then over and above that, we had our own fit-out FF&E contractors, right? So, you know, we had to contract the blinds, the carpet, the seats, the candy, the lolly shop sort of equipment, you know. And so that was multidisciplined, you know, and it really was a really good grounding in project management.
And how long were you there for?
I was there for about 6 years.
6 years. And then I think you went and worked for the Docklands Authority.
So when I was at Village, they sent me to Geneva. Right, so I did managed the first multiplex for Village Roadshow in Switzerland. And that was an amazing experience. And I was there for about 4 months, sorry. And when I came back, I just outgrew Village. And Village was going through a huge expansion prior to that, and then it was starting to slow down. So I wanted to change environments, change careers, and I knew I wanted to be a developer at that stage. And Docklands Authority, the Docklands regentrification was really probably one of the biggest sort of projects going around in Australia, right? Definitely in Victoria. It was 170 hectares of regentrification of the industrial land. I knew that it was a good training ground. There was talk around town that, you know, it's a really good starting spot if you want to become a developer because you get to meet all the big players. So I went for a job there and got a job as development director.
Wow. And what did that entail?
So I was in charge of a precinct called Batmans Hill and Victoria Harbour. Basically what we did was we put out bids to developers and basically looked at all the bids that came in and negotiated development agreements with all the different developers. And you had all the big players around Australia. You had Mirvac, MAB, all the big players. And that was fantastic because what it taught me was, A, I got to meet a lot of the developers, and B, you got to see how they structured their deals, you know, how they spaced their payments out and whatever. And then we had to work with Arthur Anderson and assess the net present values and make sure that all the bids were brought back to the same playing field so you knew which bid was financially better than the others. And then we had to assess design and track record and the ability to deliver that project.
When you take a look at Docklands today, how successful do you think it's been as a precinct? Is there any standout developers from the time that you think were most successful?
I think MAB did really well because they got in quite early, and I think Mirvac would have done really well. Look, Docklands cops a lot of flack, cops a lot of criticism. I think it was a 10-year program, probably took 15 in the end, but it was a 10-year program, and you're talking about creating a piece, a city the size of the CBD, which the Melbourne CBD took 200 years to get to where it is. Yeah. And we're trying to do it in 10, 15 years. I just don't think you can do that. I just think it needs to organically morph into what it will eventually become, and I think Docklands will become an amazing place, but it's got to go through its little mini booms and busts, and different retailers need to come in and you get that fine grain. Whereas at the moment it's a bit sort of polished and commercial. Yeah.
Yeah. And I understand when you were at the Docklands Authority, as you said, you were learning from these other bigger developers, but you're also doing some projects on the side, buying and selling and that sort of thing. Tell us about what you were learning there and what you were doing.
Yeah, probably in my early days at Village Roadshow, I started doing that and it continued on. Look, it's just in the early days, you buy an apartment, you renovate it, and you sell it, So I did a bit of that, and I did a jewel lock. Just dabbled in some small stuff, But you can talk about it, and you can tell developers to increase their bid and do a better job, but it's not until you actually do it that you realise, that you experience risk, right? And I think that's important.
And I think the first apartment you did was in South Ciarma. So tell us about that, the first apartment you renovated. How successful was that project? So
when I first started at Village, I had no money, right? I was just working from paycheck to paycheck, but I just had this desire to own property. I wanted to build up a property portfolio and do a bit of development. And back then, there were any number of apartments around South Ciarma and Windsor, 90 to 100 grand, one-bedroom apartments, the 60s and 70s style. Interest rates were 7%, and the yields on the apartments were 7%, so they washed their face. Yep. Back then, Aussie home loans and RAMs were offering 95% loans. So you needed 10% and you could get into the market. And I found a property in South Ciarma, and it was a $95,000 apartment, and I needed 95 grand. So I negotiated it, and the agent said, congratulations, you got it. And then I thought, how do I pay for this? So I had about $3,000 in the bank, and I needed 9.5. And my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, I just met, only known her for about probably a month or two, she offered to lend me $3,000. Wow. So I got up to 6, and then I had to draw up on my credit card from the ATM to get the rest. So I maxed out the credit card, put the deposit down, got a loan with Rams, and then the problem was I was getting paid every month, so I had no money to live. So I had to go and the following Monday morning I went and got a personal loan, paid Michelle back straight away, and then lived off the rest until the next paycheck, and then just slowly paid down the credit card. So that was my foray into property. So where there's a will, there's a way. I renovated it about a year later. I spent about $10,000 personally doing it myself, floorboards, painting it, and then a year later sold it for $170.
Wow.
And that was amazing, because what it sort of, up until then, you work as an employee, and you think your only source of income is what your boss can give you, right? You work for a wage. And this was something totally outside of that. And it sort of, it made me realise that you can actually create wealth or a living that's outside of your employment, or that can become your employment, and you're not reliant on someone actually, dishing out a wage every month. So that was really good learning, and it was very authoritative. It's something I wanted to keep doing.
And so you went from Village Roadshow over to the Docklands Authority, and then after the Docklands Authority, you worked for Maury Schwartz at Pan Urban. How did that come about?
At Docklands Authority, I met Maury, and he negotiated a couple of sites on Batman's Hill. We got along really well, and Watergate was the first one he did, and I sold the land and did the development agreement and all of that. And then after a couple of years, I left Docklands Authority and decided I needed some expertise out in the real world as on the private side, because in Docklands you're an umpire, right? But I wanted to be a player. So I got a job with a developer called John Sheridan, who's since passed away. And I was his development manager for a couple of years and developed the ID project in Port Melbourne on Pickle Street. That was a very successful project. And towards the end of that project, John had nothing else on the books, and I thought, what's next? And out of the blue, Maury called me and said, let's catch up for lunch. I thought, yeah, it's good. We sort of kept in touch with each other, and called me out of the blue. So I had lunch with him, and during that lunch, he offered me a partnership at Pan Urban and the role as managing director. So amazing. I joined.
And what were some of the projects you were working on at that particular point?
Yeah, so at the time, they were pretty big projects. That's how Maury sort of worked, that's how he thought it was always big. When I joined, he just started the GPO, so I worked on that. That was just a landmark building in Melbourne. And he was finishing off Watergate apartments in Docklands, which is one of the deals I did with him whilst I was there. And then we did Site 1, which was the second stage of that project when I joined. And then we did a Beckett Tower, which is 33-level apartment tower in the city, and 401 St Kilda Road.
And what are some of the fundamentals you learned from working with Maury?
The biggest thing Maury taught me was obviously vision, right? He's a bit of a visionary, but also just the importance of marketing, marketing the project and having a good public persona, of that project. So that was big for Maury. It was all about marketing and media, and that's what the imprint he left on me.
And you were, as you said, you were managing director of Pan Urban at the time. How quickly did the business grow, and how many staff were working there?
Well, look. When I joined, there was Maury, myself, a bookkeeper, and a receptionist. That was it. Yeah. So his model was outsourced. So we outsourced the project management even, and everything else, and then really, probably towards the end, we probably grew to about a staff of 10.
Okay, so
I decided to bring in the project management, and we had a few more, EAs and support staff.
And how long did you spend at Pan Urban?
Probably about 5 years.
5 years. And then you left there and I believe started a company with Tim Gurner at the time called Urban Inc.
That Urban Inc. sort of came about by necessity, really, as a lot of things probably do. Got a Beckett Tower, and I just got a Beckett Tower and 401 St Kilda Road away, and then decided I needed more assistance, so employed a couple of project managers, and Tim was one of them. Probably not long after that, probably about 18 months or 2 years after that, the GFC came, and the banks shut down, we had big projects on our sort of horizon, and the banks just weren't lending. And it was at the time when I think Maury just launched the monthly magazine, and he saw that as an opportunity to take a break and concentrate on growing his magazine and sort of, work in his media company. And the banks weren't lending; they were lending up to about 10 mil. This is the dialogue we kept getting. So we thought, what do we do? So I remember, it's clear as yesterday, I was sitting down with Tim one night and said, well, what are we going to do? We have to go and get a job, And then I remember about probably 3 years prior to that, Maury bought a site in West Melbourne for his storage. It had a crappy permit on it, about 16 apartments. And during, of course, the few years that followed, I just recut it, redesigned it into 25 smaller apartments, put an extra level, got a permit. And as soon as I got the permit, I put it in the top drawer, thinking we're never going to develop that. We do big stuff, not going to do the small stuff. And it was at that time when I was talking to Tim, and I realised we've got approach. Maury's got a piece of land with a permit. Let's see if he wants to develop it with us, right? And Maury agreed, and he was our first landowner, right? So yeah, very first landowner. And that project was called Mighty Apollo and sold very well. And we got a loan from CBA, 80% non-recourse. Which was a big test because Tim and I didn't really know if the banks would support us without Maury's imprimatur, and his balance sheet. And it was fantastic, and it was really successful. So once we got that away, we just said, we created a brand called Urban Inc. because obviously it was different to Pan Urban. And we just said, let's do more of this, And the interesting thing is we knew sales were strong, right? We knew apartment sales were strong because we just sold out at Becker Tower not long before that. And Mighty Apollo flew out the door. But there were a lot of development sites that were for sale and vendors couldn't get rid of them because the banks just weren't lending. And, it was still turbulent times, right? People were still predicting, depression. So in around about 2009, we contacted all the agents that were representing the sites and invited them in, and we just did deals with all the landowners with development agreements. And the 2 to 3 years following, or probably within 2 years, we ended up with about 20 sites. And it was fantastic, and they all sold out and they were all successful, and that's how Urban Inc. started.
So you mentioned there, Danny, that Tim Gurner was a project manager, obviously quite young at the time, working at Pan Urban, and then you went and started Urban Inc. with Tim. What was Tim like at that time? Was he the ambitious guy that we see today?
Very, very. An amazing work ethic. And no, he was amazing. So, and he grew very quickly within the company, and we worked together very well. And within Urban Inc., it was very clear from day one we were equal, right? We could, at that point, we could both do it. And in fact, I remember the early stages, we both began all the same meetings about, let's stop this, it's inefficient. You take those projects, I'll take these, and we both had full, faith in each other and our abilities to do the project.
And how long did you have that business going for, and what are some of the projects you did?
So Urban Inc. went for, I don't really know now, probably started in 2009, probably went for about 5 years. And we did a lot of projects. And the whole idea of Urban Inc. was the market, it was all, driven by the banks and the market. So the banks wouldn't lend 100 million or 50 million, they'd lend small amounts of money at the time. So we thought, well, if we can't do 300 apartments in a tower, we'll do, 10 projects with 30 in them. So they were small boutique projects. And we did projects like Alessi, we did about 4 in West Melbourne, right? There was Tivoli, Santorini, Alessi, the list goes on. There was heaps. We did some townhouses in Preston. And we ended up doing a big one in Collingwood called Oxley. And that was a big site, and we were really worried about probably about 240 apartments, and we didn't know if the banks were there, we didn't know if the sales were there to soak up that many apartments. So we designed it into 4 separate buildings and gave them their own identity, and the car parks were independent. And what happened was the first building sold out, and then the agent said, look, we've got buyers, let's keep going. And we thought, how are we going to fund this? So we spoke to ANZ, and they said, well, look, we'll fund you if you get the sales, you've got your funding. And so we just kept going, the whole thing sold out. And then got that away. So that was sort of against the grain of what Urban Inc. did, but it was it was a great project.
And so you had Urban Inc. for 4 or 5 years, then you went separate ways and you started Urban DC. Tell us about the decision to go out on your own again and just have your own venture.
You know, we did a lot of projects in Urban Inc. and it was all fantastic, but it got to a point, there was about probably 3 projects sort of just under construction, just got pre-sold and was under construction. Look, we both had different sort of aspirations for our futures, right? So I wanted to go smaller, do less projects, 2 or 3 at a time. And it was clear that, you know, Tim wanted to do bigger projects and have more staff, and that's fantastic, and he's done a great job with all of that. And it was an amicable arrangement. We said, well, you know, let's create our own separate brands. And I think Tim's first project, I think, may have been the one in Brisbane, and my first project was Oscar Brighton in Brighton, and I created Urban DC and he created Ciarma. But the interesting thing was we still had, so we had about 16 staff within Urban Inc. Right? So we had all the project managers and all the support staff. We had a pact where that support staff would assist Tim and assist me, as well as the Urban Inc. project. So out of the same office for about 18 months, we had the 3 brands operating within the same premises. It confused a lot of people, but that's the reason why. And then once the last Urban Inc. project was completed, I moved out and went our separate ways.
Now, the Urban DC business, I understand it's just yourself involved. What do you focus on? What's the mandate?
Look, it's so with Urban Inc. we did a lot of small apartments, right? It was very much driven by the market, and the market was driven by investment-driven stock, and very small because a lot of the buyers were Asian, local and offshore, and that's what they wanted, and we had to meet a certain price point. And I just sort of felt we'd overdone that. You know, I just had this feeling that it's so many of them, and I just felt like it was a commodity, not real estate, and I wanted to do more bigger apartments, better quality in terms of, you know, finishings, and that really meant owner-occupier stock. So when I started Urban DC around about 2013, 2014, my first project in Brighton, and that was the demographic for it, was owner-occupier stock. And that's sort of what I strove to do within Urban DC.
And you mentioned there the Oscar Brighton project, stunning project as all of the projects you do are. You can tell there's a certain architectural flair in all of the projects. How much input do you have into the architectural decision making?
Yeah, a lot. Look, they're not my designs, right? So I'm not taking anything away from the architects. I work with great architects and they do a really good job, but I am very descriptive with my vision and what I want and the type of materials I want and how certain buildings are to be pitched, because that's how I'm going to sell it to the purchasers. So yeah, very hands-on, and it flows right through to all the internal finishes, and you know, it's very much a collaboration, really.
And what are some of the fundamentals you look for when you are considering a new project or you are looking at a new site? What are some of the, you know, main fundamentals you look for? Area, size, that sort of thing.
In the locations that has the demographic that can support what I want to do, right? It's in nice leafy streets, or it can be in a main road, but it's got to be close to social infrastructure and close to transport. They're the main criteria. And then you start looking at the aspect of the block. You know, is it a corner site? They're always best. Is it dimensioned well? Is there a planning policy that supports what you want to do? I just look at all those attributes, you know, and then there's other attributes that some sites just have, you know, like water views, for instance, which is my Frankston site. So there's other things that sort of layer up on top of that.
You mentioned the Frankston site there, which is fascinating. Just got approval, I think, in the last week or 2 weeks. Tell us about what you're trying to achieve with that one.
When I saw the site, look, I think Frankston's untapped. Right? I think there's a huge market there, and no one's really delivered a product for that market. When I saw the site, it's undoubtedly one of the best sites in Frankston. It's on a high sand dune within the CBD. It's a C1 site, but it's a very leafy street, 10-minute walk to the train station, and it's opposite the Frankston Pier, and there's water views from ground floor. Right? I brought the site because of those attributes, but also, you know, there's a hospital, there's a shopping centre, there's a university. There's so many attributes that Frankston has. It has Melbourne's best features. Yeah. And not to mention the gateway to the peninsula, but more importantly, it's flanked by a lot of wealthy suburbs, right? So Mount Eliza's got a huge, you know, pretty high medium house price and very large, expensive homes there. Mount Martha, Mornington, and even Frankston South, there's a bit of money. And I just know there's a catchment there of owner-occupiers that want to downsize. And they don't want to move into the city, they want to stay where they've raised their children.
Absolutely.
So I'm providing that opportunity for them.
And tell us about the apartments in terms of the mix of 2-3 bedrooms, the actual the configuration of the project itself.
It's a mix of 1 bed, 2 bed, 2 baths and 3 beds. And it's more weighted towards the 2 bed, 2 baths and the 3 beds. And, you know, the 2 beds are around 80 square metres, and the 3 beds range from 110 square metres to 140.
And how's the project been received so far?
Amazing. It's quite amazing. So I've got a local agent who has a large database of pre-qualified people. We've already got expressions of interest, people waiting for more information. So I've just got the permits, so I'm putting together all the marketing. Yeah. So there's a big list of people who want to, you know, purchase at the moment. So it's I think it'll do very well.
So you've got the Frankston Project underway, or shortly to be underway. What else are you working on at the moment in Melbourne? And then we'll touch on Sydney as well.
So I've got one project under construction at the moment, which finishes in about 3 weeks' time, and co-build's building that, and that's 18 apartments in Caulfield. They're all sort of 130 square metres, and you know, I think, look, it's an owner-occupier stock. There's a lot of cash buyers in there, so I think they'll settle well. But with this COVID-19, it's always a bit tricky. But I think so far everything looks okay. So I've got that, and then I've got the Frankston Project, which I'll do an off-market launch first, and then see how the market looks before I launch it. And then I've got one that I've just put into planning for 38 large high-end apartments in Armidale, and that's a joint venture with GLG, and that's right in the heart of Armidale on High Street. Beautiful woods bagot design building, and I think there'll be a landmark building once we get that up.
And what have you got on the go in Sydney, or what have you completed over the past, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so Sydney, I finished a couple of years ago. I finished a project in Rozelle. That was about 26 luxury apartments. A lot of them had water views, and I've got one in Rose Bay at the moment, which we're very close to getting a permit. Just negotiating final outcomes. Again, there'll be about 30 apartments. That's right on the border of Vaucluse and Rose Bay. And I think, once we get to the other side of this COVID, that market's going to be strong. It's still there, that market, that owner-occupier market. And there's a couple of other opportunities that I'm working with. I've got a business colleague who has land up there. So there's an opportunity to do one in Bondi and also Surrey Hills, in due course.
And it's quite rare to see a developer in Melbourne, one-man band like yourself, expand up into Sydney. How different are the two markets, and I guess how do you manage flying between the two states and having projects on the go in two cities? I had to sort of acquaint myself with all the new consultants when I first entered the market. So I was flying up every week and having face-to-face meetings. But once the project's on a roll, it's you pretty much manage it remotely. I was going up every fortnight. I did the project management from Melbourne, and it's all about setting the project correctly with the contract and the PPRs, the principles requirements, and making sure it doesn't go off the train tracks from that point on. And in terms of the markets, look, the Sydney market, planning is much harder. Right? Planning is extremely difficult in Sydney, and I just think with their geographical constraints and their planning constraints, I think there's always going to be pent-up demand in Sydney. And have you seen Melbourne change over the time that you've been operating here, both at Pan Urban, then at Urban Inc., now at Urban DC? How's the market changed? Probably
the biggest game changer was in the early 90s when I was sort of just getting out of uni, when Melbourne City Council implemented a postcode 3000 policy, and that was to bring apartment living into the city. So prior to that, there was really very minimal apartments within the CBD, and at night time, if you walked around, it was just ghost town. So from 92, pretty much 92 onwards up until the 2004 downturn, there was a lot more influx of apartments into the city and also within Docklands, and it was sort of like Melbourne discovered apartments, I think, for the first time, really. Those apartments were, I think, a lot bigger to the following cycle. They were, a lot of apartments, even if, regardless if it was sold to investors or owner-occupiers, they were 100 square metre 2 bedrooms and 60 square metre 1 bedrooms, and the 3 bedrooms would only exist on the top level or the sub-penthouse level. I think after the downturn, it went sideways for about 2 years. Like, we just could not give an apartment away in 2004. And in the start of the new cycle, 2006, when we got a Beckett Tower away, there was a flight to price point sensitive apartments, right? So there was a limit to what people could pay, and I think that always happens at the start of a new cycle, right? Everyone's a bit sort of worried there's not as much money around, and as the cycle matures, the price points creep up and the apartment sizes creep up and so forth. And that was the real start of the really small apartments within Melbourne, was from 2006 onwards. And a Beckett Tower was one of the first. I think there was Society building done in South Ciarma just before us, and then a Beckett Tower, and we had, with a Beckett Tower, we had 40 square metre one beds and 45 square metre two beds, and they just flew out the door. Right? And so as that market matured, so we were selling that for 8,000 a metre, but pretty much a year later, around 2007, the owner-occupier market sort of got strong as well. And there was a bit of a mini boom in that, and that's when we did 401 St Kilda Road. And there was a few landmark buildings done at that same time. There was Lucient across the road and One Clarendon. I think the SB was around that time. And so there was almost like there was two markets. You had the investment-driven market, which was driven by the Asians, and that was about 7,000 to 8,000 a metre. And then you had the local owner-occupier market, and that was at 18,000 a metre back then in 2007. That market sort of seemed short-lived, but the investment-driven market just kept going, up until 2017, just kept going. And as that matured, they got bigger and bigger.
And how do you see the market today? I mean, obviously we're living in challenging times at the moment, but how have you seen the Melbourne market and the Sydney market, for that matter, over the past 6 to 12 months?
Look, Melbourne and Sydney have been going in parallel, probably within the last 5 or 6 years. They were going in parallel. So up until 2017, both markets were very strong. There was a lot of investors in the market, but it was also a lot of owner-occupiers. They started to come back. And 2007, due to government policy, FIRB policies and the Royal Banking Commission, they just really put an end to the investor-driven product. The owner-occupier product has really taken off and supported the market and supported developers. But where we sit today, I think both Melbourne and Sydney, once we get to the other side of COVID-19, it's owner-occupier. Right? The investors aren't back yet. I've not seen any evidence of it, and Sydney's exactly the same. So whether there's policies that get put in place that bring that back remains to be seen. I think the government might even look at maybe off the plan savings again. Stamp duty savings for off the plan. I mean, I'm confident that they'll continue a policy of immigration. Right, Australia needs that, probably more so after this is over, and education's important. They need to support that. So I see the Asians still coming to Australia, Melbourne and Sydney. I see that, and I think once the market comes back, whenever that is, and whatever baseline that is, I think there'll be a long-term trend upwards.
And given that you do cater to the owner-occupier market and have done for some time, what are some of the things when you are building projects for that particular demographic that they really want to see in a development? Apart from beautiful design, what else do they really want to see?
Really good layouts, right? Living rooms that work, dining table, you can fit a nice dining table with the family and the grandkids, a really nice appointed kitchen, and really just really nice outlook in a nice environment, a nice location. What happened was from 2006 onwards, there was a flight to the bottom, right? Who can do the smallest apartments and get the smallest price point and the biggest rate per square metre? In the last cycle, up until pre-COVID, it was a race to the top, right? It was like, who can throw in more, right? Who can put the best marble on their kitchen benches? Who can throw in the fireplaces? And it just got really, really bloated, really. And I think developers were doing that to woo the purchasers rather than the purchaser demanding it. Right? And it sort of becomes self-prophesising too. The purchasers see one project and they want it on the next, and then they ask for it. But yeah, it's pretty much that. I mean, look, we do three-bedders, but it's very rare that a downsizer would need 3 bedrooms. Generally, they just can't see themselves moving from a big house to a 2-bedroom or a 1-bedroom, so that's more of a comfort measure. And the second bedroom's really only for grandkids when they come over, and the third bedroom's a study or a sewing room. But that's generally what happens. That's a generalisation. There are some purchases. I did one in Balaclava and 3 at Carlisle Street, the biggest apartment we merged to, and it was a fairly young retired couple, and they still had sort of 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who were living there, sort of part-time. So there, you do get some downsizers that look to make that next move before the children are even out of home. Yeah, so that you have a bit of that as well.
I'm interested to know, you mentioned there that a lot of developers have been, and especially after this COVID situation, will get into the owner-occupier market. How do you differentiate your product from others?
You know, you just hope that you do beautiful design, and location is very important. And at the end of the day, your project's not always right for everyone, right? So people have certain criteria, and one of that criteria is location. So your project simply just, you know, won't suit their needs. So really, I like doing really efficient floor plans, right? So that for every square metre they're paying for, it's usable. Right? And I think that's important, and then it feels more spacious when you walk in, and they can see that on the floor plan. You know, I don't try and use gimmicks like trying to woo purchasers of certain finishes, whatever. I just want to do it. It's got to be pure, it's going to be real, and it's got to be, you know, nice livable apartments that look nice in the right street. That's all you can do, and then you just need to price it accordingly.
And what are some of the challenges you foresee in the market at the moment?
The main challenge is that you can't get a good site. You know, just finding a site at the right price. You know, so many people have jumped in, and along the way there was many disruptors that have created that issue. And it's just everyone complains about the same thing. It's gold to get a good site. Yeah. You know, at the right price.
How do you get around that? I mean, is it a process of looking at what agents have off market, or is it just driving past the site and trying to approach the landholders?
I've done that many times. Look, I haven't bought a site on market probably ever. I think back in pan-urban days, 401 St Kilda Road was the only one we bought on market. Every other project I've ever done has been a joint venture with the landowner or an off-market purchase with the landowner, like a Beckett Tower was. It was an off-market, Frankston was an off-market, and my other projects within Urban DC have been just, you know, joint ventures with landowners that, not in a landowner capacity, it was a real joint venture, but they had the land which we purchased into. So. I just don't know how people can just buy on market with thousands of others, you know, looking at the same thing, and you know, there'll always be 20 more developers than me that will pay higher. So
do you still sort of check in and go to auctions and see what's happening, or you just prefer just to do
I look at the results.
Yeah.
But I don't waste my time anymore.
No.
It's just a waste of time.
One thing I have to ask you, there's a lot of debate, as you'd be aware, about stamp duty versus land tax. Where do you stand on that?
I think this is counterintuitive. I think stamp duty is an important part of the asset class, right? I think the fact that there's expensive transaction costs means that people aren't selling as quickly as they could, or buying as quickly as they could, right? Like shares, it's a lot more liquid. Yeah. And therefore you get the volatility, right? Property, because of those expensive transaction costs, it's not as liquid. Right, and I actually think that's a good thing, right? A lot of developers will kill me for saying that, but I think it actually is good. And I just think if you're an investor that has a portfolio, I just think the increased running costs would be detrimental to that portfolio. So I'd rather have the one-off hit and just be done with, to be honest. Yeah.
One of the things that when I was researching about yourself that I heard you mention a couple of times in different interviews and that sort of thing is that you actually do socialise with other developers, which is quite unusual. You're friends with quite a few of them, you spend time with them. Tell us about that.
We're pack animals, I guess. I don't know. I mean, look, I think, you know, a lot of developers respect each other's work and what we do, right? And when you're in the same industry, you've got a lot in common. And property is one of those industries, more so than probably any other, where you need intel. Right, you're constantly checking in on what's selling, what's not selling, you know, what's the new trend and what's the new design trend, and which locations are now hot and which aren't. You constantly need that intel, and by having friends that are in the game, right, in the industry, you know, you've always got someone that's doing what you're about to do. You know, they've done it 2 months earlier, right? They might have gone through a settlement process, and you can touch base and say, well, you know, how are the vowels looking? How's it going? How is finance freely available? Or you're about to, you know, embark on a sales process, and then my experience I can share with friends. But it's really more just the fact that we all have a lot in common.
And you mentioned there finance, which I have to ask you about. What's the lending environment like at the moment? Are you finding it challenging?
Which lending environment? There's different ones, right? So term facilities for development land is extremely hard, right? Banks are 40% if they're prepared to lend 40, 50%. I'm talking about the majors now, right? And they've always been down on development land, unless it's an income-producing property that sort of, can be seen as an investment property. They're very, very down on just benign development sites that don't have much income. Construction lending, I've never had a problem with, never, Once you get your pre-sales, and if you've got a track record and you've got your pre-sales and you've got a good builder, the construction funding's always there. I've never had a problem with that. And then you've got mortgages for the mums and dads.
Yeah.
Look, they have their challenges. I haven't I've been quite lucky because in my urban DC days, I've been sort of dealing with locals, owner-occupiers, well heeled. A lot of them are cash buyers, and the ones that do borrow are just topping up. They're not trying to max out the loan. So I can't really speak for the product types that have been developed over the last 5 years that had offshore sales and investor-driven stock. I'm not sure. I think, look, they're still borrowing, they're still lending, banks are still there. I think LVRs may have dropped a little bit. Now we've got COVID-19, that's another disruptor.
Yeah.
I'm told, that banks are still lending, people are still settling. You see results of developers still getting through their settlements. And I know that on my project in Caulfield, the ones that need finance are pre-approved, just waiting for the valuation to come in. So yeah, lending is challenging. And you might find that with COVID-19, the banks are freeing up a little bit, right? They're probably helping, people a bit more.
Yeah. A couple of quick ones to finish. In terms of legacy, what sort of legacy do you want to leave? And part two, what legacy do you think Maurice Schwartz left or other developers left that you look up to?
So part one, look, I don't see what I do as, I don't strive to leave a legacy, right? I just love what I do. I love the creativity of it. I love property. I love the built form. I love coming up with a vision and coming up with a set of documentation or a marketing plan that purchasers fall in love with, right? Or a product that they fall in love with, and then they move in and that becomes their home. That to me is amazing. And I just want to keep doing that. I suppose from a legacy point of view, just one day driving around with the grandkids and saying, I did that building, that's all.
Yeah.
I don't want to be remembered for anything great, that's me. But in terms of Maurie, I think Maurie's legacy is just a creative visionary, that took on difficult projects like the GPO,
yep.
Right? And just, I think, Maurie he's in the arts, he's a publisher, and I think those worlds collided within the property industry. He was very interested in the PR side of the property and the marketing side of it. So he was well known for creating those one catchphrases, like with 401 St Kilda Road, he put down worth every million, right? And the media caught on to that, yeah. Right? And we had a project, it was an urban project, and it was we called it Tivoli,
yeah.
And spelled backwards is I love it. Maurie came up with Tivoli, I love it, right? So he was renowned for doing that, and just creating amazing projects, and he's left some landmark buildings for Melbourne.
Is there any other developers that you look to for inspiration, or that you think are doing great things either in Melbourne and Sydney?
Yeah, look, there's a whole heap of them. I don't know if I want to name them all, but I always look up to certain developers, and you know that when they develop something, it's going to be good. Yeah. And they're the ones I look for. And it's usually the boutique type developers that are doing similar buildings to what I aspire to do. I love our wood house, for instance. I love that, and I use that as the brief with Woods Baggett, who designed that. I said, I want that. Yeah. I want use that as the inspiration. So, there's developers out there that sure you aspire to.
Finally, where do you want to go from here? You've obviously got the Frankston Project on the go, but what does the next 12 to 24 months look like?
Look, it all depends on how the market's looking with this COVID virus, but I've got a few projects that will come out of planning. I'd like to get them away, and probably in the next 6 months I'll be looking for the next wave of projects. So, I tend to put the foot on the brake or the pedal depending on what I've got on at the moment. And I know that once I get the two that come out of planning plus Frankston into pre-sales mode, I know that I'm going to need to digest another round of properties because there's a fair bit of time frame in between projects, right? So I know that 2 to 3 years out I'll have nothing unless I, get the next project. So I'll just be doing that. And I've got the luxury of just dovetailing in and out depending on where the market's at. And yeah, it's not something that I have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Danny, it's been a pleasure hearing your journey, what you're up to today. Thanks so much for joining us.